On Failure, Part 2. Rome, the Stoics, and Jesus. The Romans, Publius Quintilius Varus, Mark Antony. As the Greek world blended into history, the Romans emerged and dominated it. Although Roman mercy designated Athens a free city after conquering it in the 1st century, it was little more than a Roman satellite. Rome took mercy on Athens out of respect for its schools. The Roman general Sulla destroyed every building in Athens except the administrative structures, monuments, and schools. But Roman dominance came from their ability to do what scholarly Athens and warrior Sparta were never able: consolidate the scholar and warrior into a single ideal character. The world would see this singular individual reemerge during another great Italian period in the form of the Renaissance man. Such a show of mercy was unusual for Rome. Their culture treated dominance as evidence of social and personal virtue, and failure as evidence of character deficiency. Indeed, failure was so shameful that Roman history is littered with commanders and statesmen committing suicide after humiliating failures. Famously, Publius Quintilius Varus, a general under Emperor Augustus, committed suicide after clumsily losing 3 legions at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. There are few defeats in history for which blame more justly belongs to the commander, and the routing is still legendary today. But perhaps the most famous example was Mark Antony, whose failure at the Battle of Alexandria led him and Cleopatra committing suicide. Shakespeare takes liberty in dramatizing their fates, but what we know aligns with the essence of what he tells us. As Plutarch explains, rather than live with the humiliation of failure, they took their own lives. Ironically, the antidote for this shame of failure was embedded in a philosophical tradition of Rome itself. Its emergence marks a significant turning point in how the modern Western world understands failure. The Stoics, Zeno and Epictetus. In 300 BC, a haggard, gloomy introvert began teaching at the painted porch, or stoa, of the Agora in Citium. Although a wealthy and well-connected merchant, he lived an ascetic life that demonstrated simplicity and indifference to one's circumstances, insisting that virtue was singularly necessary and sufficient for a happy life. In doing so, Zeno of Citium built the structure of what would become one of the most beautifully practical systems of character development the world has so far seen: Stoicism. Zeno, like Heraclitus after him, taught that the universe shifts and convulses, that everything within it is upset by its movements. We can't even hope to control it. We can only hope to respond to it. This includes where we're born and raised, our natural talents, our health, our wealth, our reputations. We didn't choose our families or how they would nurture or traumatize us. We didn't choose our genetics. Wealth comes and goes depending on the whims and tastes of the world, and one's reputation is often based on the easily manipulated opinions of ignorant people, causing many bad people to enjoy good reputations and bad people to be admired. Conversely, to the Stoic, failure too is largely the product of circumstances outside our control. Therefore, true success and failure is found in how a person responds to their circumstances rather than the circumstances themselves. The basis of our responses are our thoughts and opinions. We cannot control whether we're seized by tragedy, such as the loss of a loved one, but we can choose how we respond to the loss. We can choose to succumb to bitterness and resentment, or choose to use our circumstances as an opportunity to overcome grief and thereby become stronger. We can suffer the slanders of immoral or misguided people, entertaining anger and vengeance, or we can disregard their lies as we would the insults of a child. Understanding their attack on our false reputation is like attacking us for being Santa Claus. The fully realized Roman character eventually comes to be embodied in the Stoic. Alongside comes the view that failure, from the win-loss point of view, is often the product of circumstances outside a person's control. Therefore, failure isn't measured against achievement. Rather, like Oedipus and Leonidas, success and failure are measured by how we respond to our circumstances. It's a secularized view that substitutes the gods with circumstances, which are equally capricious and unpredictable and perhaps less forgiving, but also more human and therefore more real to us. While Marcus Aurelius gets most of the attention for his Stoicism, the Stoic archetype is embodied differently, but is at least as well represented by the first century teacher Epictetus. Born a slave in Phrygia, which is modern-day Turkey, he was dropped into a world in which he had little control over anything, including his own body. Even to study philosophy, he had to be given permission by his master, Epaphroditus, himself a freed man under Emperor Nero. But once that permission was granted, Epictetus distinguished himself brilliantly. Epaphroditus eventually granted Epictetus his freedom, realizing that keeping such a brilliant mind enslaved would deprive and therefore keep all of humanity enslaved. Epictetus perfectly embodies the Stoic ideal of not measuring success and failure by our circumstances, but rather by our responses to our circumstances. His success wasn't in being freed, rather, it was in the proper control of himself within the circumstances over which he did not have control. His volitional choice to maximize his abilities within the context of being a slave, which he did not choose. Oedipus could have learned much from Epictetus, for though fate promised him a horrible situation, he brought the horrible to tragedy by his response to it. Jesus. 4 centuries after Zeno appeared at the porch, a carpenter from Galilee spoke to a crowd assembled near the Chorazin plateau in northern Israel. There, he corrected the Roman ideals of individual strength and social excellence, preaching instead that the meek rather than the powerful would inherit the earth, that the merciful would be shown mercy, that those who are persecuted for righteousness would receive the kingdom of heaven. In so doing, this carpenter, Jesus of Nazareth, taught that failure takes only one form, failing to submit to God's will. Like the Stoics, this reorientation of the Roman world in which Jesus lived brought the world to an understanding that true success and failure aren't measured against earthly metrics of victory, status, money, or property, all of which are self-serving and temporary to one's own existence and ultimately outside of one's control, but against submission to God. It doesn't matter whether your army stands against impossible odds or is defeated, or if you're exiled or executed or humiliated or make horrendous professional blunders, or if you're an emperor or a slave. None of that is true failure, just as overcoming any of them isn't true success. True success is submitting to God's will despite circumstances and outcomes. True failure is seeking independence from God. In fact, while victory, status, money, or property don't preclude a person from following God, they certainly get in the way. It's difficult for a healthy, wealthy person to recognize their dependence on God when the secular model seems to be working so well for them. It's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. On the other hand, those who are poor and powerless have a far more obvious need to cling to God. The humble walk closer to faith than the self-proud. But the West has failed in its spiritual calling. Especially in the late 19th or early 20th centuries, upon the proclamation of the death of God, the West retreated into a secularism that diametrically opposes the vision of success Jesus set forth. Once again, the West is consumed by a focus on victory, status, money, or property at any cost in order to attain the fundamental secular description of success. Failure to attain these things, naturally enough, is failure in life, and we in the West are made certain to feel that failure, which ultimately is really just a failure to consume in place of worship. And it's no surprise that as the West has grown increasingly secular over the past half-century, we've tilted heavily towards rejecting the reorientation Jesus laid out in the Sermon on the Mount, especially its central message of submission to God. However, the West has found a way to maintain parts of Jesus' general message. Almost as an apology for our material wealth, the meek and powerless are still venerated, but as the oppressed. For their status as victims of a system we expect the poor to not compete within. But rather than relying on God and his reward in the afterlife to render earthly suffering almost moot, the oppressed in the West are commanded to rely on the human collective for an earthly reward. In every way, this is an anti-message to what Jesus delivered at Chorazin. On the Mount, Jesus honored the meek and humble for what they are. In the West, we honor them for what they are to us, a means to power and a means to assuage guilt. Failure in the modern West. Therefore, in the secular West, failure is increasingly defined as failing to conform to social trends. This is the West's answer to an existential crisis in which, free from religion and traditional moral restraint, we wrestle with our individual littleness in the face of the monstrous enormity of unconscious eternity. In response, we seek meaning by joining our littleness to the masses of others who make our existence a bit less little, and thereby a little more meaningful. To put it another way, the fear of insignificance drives us to the comfort of crowds. As Ernest Becker noted, man cannot endure his own littleness unless he can translate it into meaningfulness on the largest possible level. Especially in such a climate, an individual who stands outside the collectivizing social mass is perceived as an existential threat to it. Her very existence is a counter-narrative to the need for joining with others. He who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must be either a beast or a god. And just as one who refuses Jesus' call to submit to God's will is an unbeliever, the individual who stands apart from, and especially up to, the social mass is anathema to the collective secular herd. So, a curious thing is happening. Rather than becoming more tolerant of differences, the West has become more polarized because differences in how we choose to live, joined with the masses or independently, are framed as a threat to those who choose to live differently. Failure, then, as to conform to social trends, is not seen as individual or personal. Instead, the individual's failure to conform is seen as a threat to the social mass. This has led to an ostracization of the individual as part of an effort to stamp them out, just as an immune system attacks a virus to stop it from spreading. This modern imposition of casting failure as a refusal to conform is devious. Annihilating those who choose not to conform, modern society puts itself at risk. The view that's presently held is itself a product of unconformity and would never have come about if previous views had behaved as the modern one does. The danger is that the present view sees itself as the final necessary view, believing itself to be the objective endpoint of history. There's no room for synthesizing alternatives because alternatives would destroy what presently is. Although it comes at great psychological risk, the West must reject this emerging vision of failure. It must make it safe again to be a dissident because progress has only ever been instigated by those who have dared to think and behave differently. Otherwise, the West will stagnate, lodging ourselves into what is, unable to adapt to a changing world of what could be. That would be the ultimate failure, which we could not change our perspective out of. Thank you for watching and listening. Me and Fyodor really appreciate it. We hope you got something useful out of it. Be well.